The tension in the Congressional hearing room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat calmly at the panel, her deep purple blazer standing out against the wood-paneled walls, her gaze steady and focused. Across from her, Kash Patel, the 43-year-old former Defense Department official, leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," Patel said, adjusting his red tie, "you're new to Washington. You don't understand how national security works. I've served at the highest levels of government while you were still figuring out how Congress operates." Several Republican committee members nodded in agreement. Patel continued, his confidence growing with each word. "I've briefed presidents. I've managed classified operations. I've protected this nation while politicians played games," he declared. "So, forgive me if I don't think a freshman representative should be questioning my judgment or my loyalty to this country." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to Crockett, expecting her to back down or launch into a defensive rant. The committee chairman started to intervene, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, indicating she had this under control. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in on her face, capturing her composed expression. Unlike many politicians who might have shown anger or flustered indignation at such dismissive treatment, Crockett remained perfectly calm. Those who knew her recognized this calm not as passivity, but as the focused concentration of a skilled attorney preparing to deliver a closing argument. Patel sat back slightly, a hint of a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had used this tactic successfully before, invoking his national security credentials to dismiss congressional oversight as uninformed meddling. In the past, it had either provoked emotional responses that made his questioners appear unserious, or intimidated them into backing down. But something about Crockett's steady gaze suggested this encounter might play out differently. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward in their seats, sensing that this exchange was about to take an unexpected turn. A veteran Capitol Hill reporter would later tell his colleagues he knew something extraordinary was coming by the way Crockett slowly placed her pen down and clasped her hands in front of her. What happened next would send shockwaves through Washington and make headlines across America. In just one perfectly crafted sentence, 21 words to be exact, Jasmine Crockett would demolish Kash Patel's entire defense and leave the hearing room in stunned silence. If you want to see how a brilliant congresswoman dismantled a condescending witness with just one sentence, hit that subscribe button and keep watching. This is a masterclass in speaking truth to power that you won't want to miss. Leave a comment below about a time when someone underestimated you and how you proved them wrong. Now let's get into exactly how Congresswoman Crockett set up this unforgettable moment. The House Oversight Committee hearing had been called to investigate serious allegations about the mishandling of classified documents and potential obstruction of justice. Kash Patel, who had served as Chief of Staff to the Acting Secretary of Defense and in various intelligence roles, was a key witness. At 43, Patel had built a reputation as a fierce defender of his former boss and a sharp critic of anyone who challenged him. With his dark suits, perfectly knotted ties, and confident demeanor, he projected the image of a Washington insider who couldn't be intimidated. The hearing room was packed with journalists, staffers, and curious onlookers. C-SPAN cameras captured every moment. Committee members from both parties had prepared their questions carefully, knowing the high stakes of this particular session. Patel had spent the first hour of the hearing answering questions with practiced ease. When Republicans asked friendly questions, he expanded his answers with colorful details about his distinguished service. When Democrats pressed him on inconsistencies, he expertly deflected, sometimes turning the questions back on them or dismissing them as political theater. "I've dedicated my life to protecting American interests," Patel stated multiple times. "My record speaks for itself." Then it was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's turn. At 43, the same age as Patel, Crockett had followed a different path to power. Before entering Congress, she had built a respected career as a civil rights attorney and state representative in Texas. Known for her sharp legal mind and unwillingness to suffer fools, she had quickly distinguished herself as someone who came to hearings meticulously prepared. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, adjusting her microphone. "Mr. Patel, I appreciate your appearance today." Patel nodded stiffly, clearly bracing himself. He had watched videos of Crockett's questioning in previous hearings and knew she wouldn't toss him softballs. "I'd like to discuss your statements regarding the handling of classified documents," Crockett continued. "In your interview with Fox News on September 12th, you claimed that certain documents had been properly declassified through the appropriate channels. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's accurate," Patel replied confidently. "I was involved in the declassification process myself. Everything was done by the book." "And yet," Crockett said, holding up a document, "when asked about those same documents under oath in your deposition last year, you stated you had no direct knowledge of any declassification procedures being followed." "Those are your exact words from the transcript." Patel shifted in his seat. "Context matters, Congresswoman. Those were different circumstances." "Different circumstances?" Crockett repeated slowly. "So, the truth changes based on where you're speaking and who's listening." Several Democratic committee members nodded. A journalist in the front row scribbled furiously in her notebook. "That's not what I said," Patel responded, a slight edge entering his voice. "You're twisting my words. This is exactly the kind of political grandstanding that Americans are tired of." Crockett remained unfazed. "I'm simply quoting your own statements, Mr. Patel. In one forum, you claimed direct involvement. Under oath, you claim no knowledge. Both cannot be true." Patel leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Congresswoman, these are complex national security matters. With all due respect, you've been in Congress for what, a year? I've served my country in the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the intelligence community." He gestured dismissively. "I understand you're trying to make a name for yourself, but these gotcha questions only demonstrate your inexperience with how classified information actually works." The Republican committee members smiled slightly. The chairman glanced at the clock, perhaps hoping to move on to less contentious questioning. Patel continued, gaining momentum. "I don't expect you to understand the nuances of classified information handling. That comes with experience. Experience you simply don't have." A slight murmur ran through the room. Patel had crossed an unspoken line, moving from defending his own actions to openly disrespecting a member of Congress during a formal hearing. But Crockett didn't appear offended. In fact, those who knew her recognized the slight raise of her eyebrow, a sign that she had been waiting for exactly this opening. She glanced down at her notes, then back up at Patel. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were razor-sharp. "Mr. Patel," she said evenly, "before I was elected to Congress, I spent 15 years as a trial attorney. I've cross-examined hundreds of witnesses who tried to evade questions exactly as you're doing now." She picked up another document. "Let's be more specific then. On June 3rd, you signed this certification stating all classified materials had been returned, yet we now know that was false. How do you explain that?" Patel's face hardened. "Again, Congresswoman, you're oversimplifying complex matters of national security. You clearly haven't read the Presidential Records Act properly, or you'd understand the distinction between personal and presidential records." He shook his head, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "With all due respect, you're new to Washington. You don't understand how national security works. I've served at the highest levels of government while you were still figuring out how Congress operates." The dismissive comment hung in the air. Several staffers exchanged glances. Patel had taken a calculated risk, betting that diminishing Crockett's experience would undermine her questioning in the public's eye. "I've briefed presidents, I've managed classified operations, I've protected this nation while politicians played games," he declared. "So, forgive me if I don't think a freshman representative should be questioning my judgment or my loyalty to this country." The room fell silent. The chairman started to intervene, concerned that Patel had gone too far in disrespecting a committee member. But Crockett raised her hand slightly, indicating she had this under control. She took a moment, looking directly at Patel, who met her gaze with confident defiance. What happened next would become one of the most replayed moments in recent congressional history. "Mr. Patel," Crockett began, her voice measured and clear, "I appreciate your service record, but service doesn't exempt anyone from accountability." Patel's expression remained unchanged, still projecting absolute confidence that he had the upper hand. "The documents we're discussing contain some of our nation's most sensitive secrets," Crockett continued. "Information that, if compromised, could put lives at risk. Do you agree with that assessment?" "Of course," Patel replied. "That's why proper handling is so important, which is what I ensured happened." "And yet," Crockett said, consulting her notes again, "we have documented evidence of these materials being stored in unsecured locations, a bathroom, a ballroom, even a shower. Does that sound like proper handling to you?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Several journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This was the heart of the matter, the direct contradiction between Patel's claimed expertise and the documented reality. Patel sighed theatrically. "Congresswoman, you're repeating misleading media narratives. The storage facilities in question were secured in accordance with Secret Service protocols." "Secret Service protocols don't cover document storage, Mr. Patel. That's not their jurisdiction, as you well know," Crockett replied. A retired intelligence officer sitting in the gallery nodded slightly, recognizing the accuracy of Crockett's point. "The Secret Service protects people, not documents. A distinction someone with Patel's background would certainly understand." "Again," Patel said with growing irritation, "this demonstrates your lack of understanding about how executive security actually works." Crockett nodded slowly. "Let's focus on something more basic then. You've stated under oath that you believed all classified documents had been returned, yet dozens more were found later. How do you reconcile those contradictory facts?" In the press section, a veteran Washington Post reporter whispered to her colleague, "She's not letting him off the hook with vague answers. Smart." A muscle twitched in Patel's jaw. There was no contradiction. The statement referred to documents we were aware of at that time. "So you're saying you signed a certification without actually verifying it was true?" Crockett asked. "That's not what I said," Patel replied sharply. "You're putting words in my mouth." "I'm asking straightforward questions about your own statements and actions, Mr. Patel," Crockett responded. "If that feels like putting words in your mouth, perhaps you should reflect on the consistency of those statements." Several Democratic committee members nodded approvingly. Crockett was methodically backing Patel into a corner, pointing out the contradictions in his various claims without raising her voice or showing frustration. An older congressman passed a note to his aide. The aide later revealed it said simply, "She's better prepared than anyone I've seen in years." Patel glanced at the Republican side of the committee, perhaps hoping for a friendly intervention. Finding none immediately forthcoming, he shifted tactics. "Look, Congresswoman, I understand you're doing your job, but these hearings have become political witch hunts. When I served in national security roles, we focused on real threats, not partisan distractions." "Is accountability a distraction, Mr. Patel?" Crockett asked. Of course not. But selective accountability driven by political motives is, he retorted. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Let's be very clear then. You've made multiple contradictory statements about these documents, saying one thing on television and another under oath. You certified all documents were returned when they weren't. You've claimed declassification procedures were followed, but you can't produce any evidence of those procedures. A former prosecutor watching the hearing from his office across town nodded with professional appreciation. This was classic cross-examination technique, methodically establishing contradictions before asking the witness to explain them. Patel's face flushed slightly. I've explained the context of each of those situations. You're deliberately mischaracterizing my statements. I'm quoting you directly, Mr. Patel, Crockett replied, holding up transcripts. These aren't my characterizations. These are your words. A woman in the audience, later identified as a former intelligence analyst, nodded vigorously. The hearing room had become unusually quiet, with even typically distracted committee members now fully engaged. Patel's frustration became more visible. Anyone can take words out of context. My record of service to this country speaks for itself. I've dedicated my career to protecting American security interests, while politicians give speeches and point fingers. The dismissive tone was back, stronger than before. Patel was clearly trying to position himself as the serious national security professional being harassed by uninformed politicians. Since you mentioned your record, Crockett said, flipping to another page in her notes, let's discuss your time at the Pentagon. You were appointed to your position after the 2020 election, correct? Yes. I served as Chief of Staff to the Acting Secretary of Defense, among other roles, Patel confirmed, seeming relieved at the change of subject. And during that transition period, you were also involved in discussions about invoking the Insurrection Act and potentially deploying active-duty military within the United States. Is that accurate? A congressional staffer later described the moment as a trapdoor opening. Patel had appeared relieved by the change of subject, only to find himself facing an even more difficult line of questioning. Patel's relief vanished. Those were confidential national security discussions. I'm not going to discuss internal deliberations here. Yet, you've discussed them extensively in your book and on multiple podcasts, Crockett noted. Those don't seem very confidential. Murmurs spread through the hearing room. A senior reporter from the Associated Press leaned forward, suddenly realizing this hearing might be front-page material rather than a routine oversight session. Patel took a sip of water, clearly buying time to compose his response. Writing about broad policy discussions after the fact is very different from revealing classified operational details, he finally said. Again, this demonstrates your lack of experience with how national security protocols actually work. There it was again, the dismissive reference to Crockett's experience. It had become Patel's go-to defense mechanism when cornered. A junior congressman whispered to his chief of staff, "Is he really talking down to a former defense attorney like she's clueless?" Bad strategy. Mr. Patel, Crockett continued, you've repeatedly questioned my experience and understanding. Let me ask you this. In your extensive national security career, did you ever receive training on the proper handling of classified materials? Of course, Patel replied immediately. Extensive training. And that training taught you that storing classified documents in bathroom closets and unsecured rooms was appropriate? Crockett asked. That's a mischaracterization. It's a yes or no question, Mr. Patel, Crockett interrupted. Did your training indicate that was proper handling? The gallery was completely silent now. A former Defense Department official who had come to support Patel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing the corner Patel was being backed into. Patel's jaw clenched. No. Thank you, Crockett said. Now, in your training, Were you taught that you could simply declare documents declassified without any formal process? The President has ultimate declassification authority, Patel began. That wasn't my question, Crockett said firmly. Were you taught that anyone, including the President, could declassify documents without following any process whatsoever? An Intelligence Committee staffer with 2 decades of experience handling classified materials nodded slightly, recognizing that Crockett was citing established protocol. Even presidential declassification follows procedures. Unwritten declassification isn't recognized in the intelligence community. The process works differently at the presidential level, Patel insisted. So, your answer is no, Crockett concluded. You were not taught that because that's not how it works, as you well know. Patel's frustration boiled over. Congresswoman, you can play these semantic games all day. The reality is that you have no idea what you're talking about. You've never handled classified information. You've never worked in national security. You've never had to make the tough calls that keep Americans safe. He leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. I have for years, at the highest levels, so forgive me if I find your amateur analysis of complex national security matters both uninformed and offensive. The room tensed. Patel had escalated the confrontation, clearly trying to dismiss Crockett entirely rather than address her specific questions. A former White House counsel watching the hearing on C-SPAN winced visibly. Never get personal with someone holding the microphone, he muttered to his colleague. First rule of congressional testimony. Crockett remained calm, allowing a moment of silence to highlight Patel's emotional response, in contrast to her composed questioning. Mr. Patel, she said finally, you've spent considerable time today telling this committee what I don't know and what I don't understand. You've repeatedly referenced your experience while dismissing mine. She closed her folder deliberately. But here's what I do understand. I understand that the law applies equally to everyone. I understand that contradicting yourself under oath raises serious questions about credibility. And I understand that when witnesses resort to personal attacks rather than answering straightforward questions, it usually means they're hiding something. Several committee members shifted in their seats. Journalists leaned forward. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in slightly on Crockett's face. So let me ask you one more time, clearly and directly, she continued. You have made 2 contradictory statements. One on national television claiming you were directly involved in declassifying documents, and another under oath claiming you had no knowledge of declassification procedures being followed. Both cannot be true. Which one is false? Patel's face darkened with anger. This was the question he had been avoiding throughout the entire hearing, the contradiction he couldn't explain away. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're cherry-picking statements made in completely different contexts. This entire hearing is a political farce designed to distract from real issues facing our country. He gestured dismissively toward Crockett. With all due respect, Congresswoman, you're simply not qualified to interrogate me about matters of national security. Your limited experience in Washington disqualifies you from understanding the complexities involved. The chairman looked uncomfortable. Patel had crossed the line, but before the chairman could intervene, Crockett spoke. What she said next would be replayed on news channels for days, shared millions of times on social media, and leave the entire hearing room in stunned silence. Congresswoman Crockett looked directly at Kash Patel, her expression calm but resolute. The room fell completely silent as she delivered the sentence that would define the entire hearing. Mr. Patel, I may be new to Congress, but I've spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize perjury when I see it, and enough time cross-examining defendants to know when someone is lying to protect themselves rather than serving their country. The words landed like a thunderbolt. Patel froze, his mouth slightly open, no response forthcoming. The confidence that had bordered on arrogance moments earlier evaporated instantly. The room remained silent for 5 long seconds, an eternity. In a congressional hearing, no one moved, no papers shuffled, even the photographers paused. Then, from the back of the room, someone whispered, "Oh my God." The words were barely audible, but in the complete silence, everyone heard them. A veteran journalist later wrote that it wasn't just what Crockett said, but how she said it, with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and wasn't bluffing. The chairman cleared his throat, clearly unsure how to proceed after such a dramatic moment. "Mr. Patel, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's observation?" Patel reached for his water glass. His hand trembled slightly, causing the water to ripple, a detail caught by cameras and endlessly analyzed later. He took a sip, buying precious seconds to compose himself. I resent the implication," he finally managed, his formerly authoritative voice noticeably weaker. "I have never committed perjury. I have served this country faithfully." But the damage was done. The confident, dismissive witness from moments earlier was gone, replaced by someone clearly shaken. Crockett wasn't finished. "Mr. Patel, this isn't about your patriotism or your service record. It's about accountability and truth. No one, regardless of position or connections, is above the law. That principle is what truly protects our national security," she said, gesturing to the documents before her. "The evidence shows a pattern of contradictory statements that cannot be reconciled, not because of different contexts or complexities, but because they fundamentally conflict with each other." Patel attempted to regain his footing. "Congresswoman, you're making serious accusations based on a flawed understanding. I'm making observations based on your own words," Crockett interrupted, her voice still measured but firm. "Words you said under oath in one setting and contradicted in another. That's not my interpretation. That's what happened." A murmur ran through the room. Several committee members who had been checking their phones or reviewing notes were now fully engaged, sensing they were witnessing a pivotal moment. "Furthermore," Crockett continued, "your repeated attempts to dismiss my questions by referencing my experience rather than addressing the substance of the contradictions only reinforces the impression that you cannot reconcile these statements." She leaned forward slightly. "The truth doesn't require elaborate explanations or attacks on the questioner, Mr. Patel. The truth stands on its own." A Democratic committee member could be heard whispering, "She's incredible." The chairman, perhaps sensing that Patel needed rescuing, announced, "The Congresswoman's time has expired." "I yield back," Crockett said, closing her folder, but the damage was done. For the remainder of the hearing, Patel was a shadow of his former self. Gone was the confident official dismissing congressional oversight as amateur hour. In his place sat a man who chose his words carefully, avoided confrontation, and repeatedly said, "I don't recall," when pressed on specifics. The moment Crockett finished her questioning, staffers could be seen rushing from the room, phones in hand. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Crockett destroys Patel with one sentence. Former DOJ official, left speechless by freshman congresswoman. Watch the exact moment Kash Patel realizes he's in trouble. By the time the hearing ended 2 hours later, the exchange had already gone viral. News anchors were playing the clip and asking legal experts to weigh in on whether Patel had indeed committed perjury, as Crockett suggested. As Crockett gathered her papers to leave, journalists swarmed around her. "Congresswoman, did you come into the hearing planning that moment?" one asked. Crockett smiled slightly. "I came prepared to ask substantive questions and to insist on substantive answers. When witnesses resort to personal attacks, rather, than addressing the facts. It usually tells you something important about the strength of their position. Another reporter pushed forward. Do you think there will be legal consequences for Mr. Patel? That's not for me to determine, Crockett replied diplomatically. My job is oversight. The Justice Department handles prosecution if warranted. As she made her way through the Capitol corridors, her phone buzzed constantly with messages and notifications. The moment had clearly struck a chord far beyond the walls of the hearing room. By evening, the video of Crockett's questioning had been viewed over 10 million times. Political commentators across the spectrum were analyzing every word, every gesture, every reaction. What we witnessed today was a masterclass in congressional questioning, said former prosecutor Alicia Montgomery on a news panel. Congresswoman Crockett methodically established the contradictions, gave the witness multiple opportunities to explain them, and only when he resorted to attacking her credentials instead of addressing the substance did she deliver that devastating line. Another analyst nodded in agreement. The power of that moment came from its authenticity. She wasn't grandstanding. She was stating what had become obvious to everyone in the room. The impact extended far beyond political circles. On social media, people shared stories of standing up to bullies and speaking truth to power, inspired by Crockett's composed determination. Watching Representative Crockett refuse to be intimidated gave me courage to speak up in my own workplace, wrote one woman, whose post received thousands of supportive comments. A high school debate coach in Ohio used the clip to teach his students about effective questioning techniques. Notice how she never raised her voice, he pointed out. She let the facts speak for themselves. Legal experts weighed in on the substance of Crockett's accusation. The conflicting statements she highlighted are genuinely troubling, noted a former federal prosecutor. When someone says one thing under oath and something completely different in public, that raises serious legal questions. 3 days after the hearing, the Justice Department announced it was reviewing the transcript for potential inconsistencies with previous sworn testimony, a development that made front-page news and sent shockwaves through Washington. Patel himself remained largely out of public view, cancelling several scheduled TV appearances. Sources close to him described him as shocked by how quickly the hearing had turned against him. He went in expecting to bulldoze his way through like he always does, said one former colleague who requested anonymity. He didn't expect to be challenged so effectively. Crockett, meanwhile, received standing ovations at subsequent public appearances. Yet she consistently deflected personal praise, focusing instead on the larger principle at stake. This isn't about me or Mr. Patel, she said at a town hall in her district. It's about a fundamental American value, that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful their connections or impressive their resume. She continued, when I was a trial attorney, I learned that the truth has a certain clarity to it. Lies require constant maintenance, remembering which version you told to whom, constructing elaborate explanations for inconsistencies. The truth simply is. The audience nodded in appreciation. What we saw in that hearing room, Crockett explained, wasn't just about classified documents or security clearances. It was about whether we still believe in equal justice under law, whether we're still committed to the principle that the same rules apply to everyone. A week after the hearing, an older gentleman approached Crockett at a community event. I've been voting for the other party my whole life, he told her, but watching you in that hearing made me proud. You weren't playing politics, you were seeking the truth. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. Say, an era of deep polarization, Crockett's moment of clarity had transcended partisan boundaries. People responded not to her politics, but to her principles, to the simple insistence that truth matters and evasion has consequences. Seasoned political observers noted another significant impact. Crockett had provided a masterclass in handling condescension. Rather than becoming defensive when Patel questioned her qualifications, she had stayed focused on the substance of her questions, allowing his dismissive attitude to ultimately undermine his own credibility. "There's a powerful lesson there for anyone who's ever been talked down to," commented Dr. Elena Rivera, a communications expert. Congresswoman Crockett showed that the most effective response to condescension isn't anger or defensiveness. It's calm competence. In law schools across the country, professors began using the exchange as a teaching tool for effective cross-examination. "Notice how she builds her case methodically," one professor told his students. "She establishes the contradictions, first gives the witness multiple opportunities to explain them, and only delivers the knockout blow when those explanations fail." For Kash Patel, the hearing marked a turning point. The invitations to prominent news shows dwindled. Publishers became hesitant about his future book prospects. The aura of untouchability that had surrounded him was broken. For Jasmine Crockett, however, the moment represented not an end, but a beginning, a clear demonstration that preparation, persistence, and principle could cut through even the most practiced defenses. As one editorial put it, in just 21 words, Congresswoman Crockett reminded us of something essential: that truth still has power, that accountability still matters, and that no amount of credentials or connections can ultimately shield someone from their own contradictions. The lesson wasn't just about politics or legal strategy. It was about the enduring power of speaking truth plainly, directly, and without fear. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether in congressional hearings, professional settings, or personal relationships. The truth, clearly stated, remains the most powerful tool we have. If you found this breakdown of Jasmine Crockett's brilliant moment inspiring, please like this video and hit subscribe. We bring you these powerful moments of truth-speaking every week. Share in the comments your own experience of speaking truth to power, or a time when you stood your ground against someone who tried to dismiss you. Remember, it's not about having the loudest voice, it's about having the clearest one.